Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 10 possible designs for the inevitable Arthas, the Lich King card that will almost undoubtedly arrive with Knights of the Frozen Throne. That's right, the new expansion was just announced, and everybody knows that Arthas is going to be the big bad guy of the expansion, which very likely means we're going to finally get an Arthas card, and since he is one of the most iconic and popular and both simultaneously beloved and hated characters in all of Warcraft lore, I have a feeling that Blizzard's going to have to go all out with this card to really satisfy what people want to see from an Arthas card. So since the hype train is going full steam at this point for Knights of the Frozen Throne, I thought it would just be fun to take a look at some custom Arthas cards that people from the community have created over the past few years in anticipation for this card, and talk through each of them and see why maybe they might work or maybe they don't work, and theorize what an actual Arthas card might look like. And in fact, I've even created an Arthas card of my own custom creation, so you guys can take a look at what I think an Arthas card should look like too. So in this video, I'll be running through 9 custom cards from the community, and then I'll be closing things out with my very own take on Arthas, the Lich King. But let's go ahead and jump into this list. Starting off with the first Lich King or Arthas card I found, this is one whose effect is actually a pretty common theme amongst many people who've made custom Arthas cards. As you can see here, the death rattle on this Lich King card says, transform a random friendly minion into the Lich King. So essentially, anytime this minion died and there's another friendly minion on the board at the time it dies, the Lich King just lives on, and there's essentially this infinite chain of new Lich King minions that continue to replace the other minion on board, which is kind of based, I think, on a line from World of Warcraft that says there must always be a Lich King. So essentially, this death rattle reinforces that idea. But I think there's some fundamental problems both with this mechanic and this particular iteration of the card using this mechanic. First and foremost, it's just not that likely by the time you get to turn 10 at any given point that there are going to be other friendly minions on the board when the Lich King dies. Simply because usually when you play a 10 mana card like this, you're giving your opponent all of the initiative and time to react and control your board state so they can trade or use AoE or whatever it may be, removal, to kill all of your stuff and then save the Lich King for last. Particularly with this iteration of the card where it only has 6 health, that's just not very hard to deal with in the late game. So essentially they could just pick apart your board and then kill the Lich King at the end, and this death rattle would not actually go into effect, so you just lose the value of this card and you'd spend a ton of mana on a slow card. Alternatively, if, for instance, this was a 9 mana card that was like an 8/10 with taunt, so that it forced some action through it, perhaps this death rattle could get a little more value, plus the fact that it had taunt would make it slightly more active on the board when you played it. And if it was just a mana cost or 2 cheaper, it seems like it'd be a lot more balanced. So if I was going to redo this card with this effect, I would actually probably make it an 8 mana, 6/9 with taunt with this same death rattle. And then I think you'd have a halfway decent playable card, although certainly this isn't the only way to envision the Lich King. So let's jump on to the next card. Here for my second card, do note that the visuals here are a little bit unique. The person who created this card came up with this visualization, which is awesome, but not particularly relevant to the interest of this video. I do just want to talk about the cards themselves. So this version of Arthas is a 10 mana minion once again, but this time a 7/8 minion, and this battle cry says summon 6 random legendaries that died this game. And I will go ahead and say this one's a little bit similar to the card design I came up with, but a little different, so you'll have to wait till the end of the video to see that one. But essentially here, what this means is if you play Arthas, it has a kind of N'Zoth effect, essentially, where it's going to be summoning stuff. But a couple points of note, it's going to summon as many as it can, much like N'Zoth, up to a full board, obviously. If only 3 legendary minions have died this game, the way this is worded, only 3 minions would get summoned. It wouldn't like do duplicates or anything like that. So Interesting. I like it a lot. I think it's a lot like N'Zoth and has a similar kind of finisher control standpoint as N'Zoth, so it works in a lot of ways in that regard. And some people might say it's a little bit overpowered because summoning that many legendaries guaranteed is just ridiculous. But frankly, it's just not that easy to kill that many legendaries in any given game, and frankly, not all legendaries are fantastic as far as just minions on the board. They're often more reliant on effects than they are just like stats or bodies. Things like Tyrion would clearly be fantastic, but that already happens with N'Zoth, and that's not a particularly unbalanced or overpowered play. Frankly, N'Zoth decks are just sort of okay. They're not dominating the meta or anything, so this doesn't look any stronger than N'Zoth necessarily, and in fact, might even be harder than N'Zoth to satisfy the condition of, because as I mentioned, sometimes it's just hard to play 6 good legendaries in your deck, because they're often high-cost cards, they're often slow, they're often doing specific things, so you might just get a lot of junk back that doesn't actually do anything, and it didn't allow you to play on curve or build your deck in a smart or sensible way. One curiosity with this card I don't actually know the answer to is whether or not this would summon legendaries of your opponents that had died, because this doesn't actually say friendly legendaries, and cards in the past with things like Anything Can Happen have in fact summoned minions from the other side of the board too, so I think this might actually mean that it could summon your opponent's legendaries, in which case this card certainly gets a lot stronger and a lot more consistent as far as the number of legendaries it can summon. All that said, it's still going to be a lot of stuff like Blood Mage Thalnos is tossed in there, right, that just aren't going to make a huge impact. So I'm still not sure this card would be overpowered, but I do think it's fairly balanced and fairly well designed, and that's why you'll see some reflections of this card in my own card way down the road when we get to number 10. So that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. At the number 3 spot is another Arthas the Lich King card, this time a 9 mana 9/9, and there's a lot to digest in this particular card text. So first off, it has a battle cry that freezes all characters. Keep in mind that's both friendly and enemy characters, so your own hero, you're shutting down your weapons, and your own minions. And keep in mind too that often freezing your own stuff during your turn is way more punishing than freezing your opponent's stuff, because it takes a full cycle of attacks to go back and actually unfreeze your minion. So this battle cry sounds really, really, really overpowered, because that kind of freeze is crazy to lock out the game. But I think it actually punishes you more than your opponent. But then it also has a death rattle here. Destroy all enemy minions, and then deal 3 damage to the enemy hero for every minion that was destroyed via that death rattle. So an effect kind of like Chill Maw, for instance. In the past, when you killed Chill Maw, if you had that dragon in hand, it would do 3 to the enemy board. And I think this operates in a very, very similar way. Now, clearly, it's going to kill stuff with more than 3 health, unlike Chill Maw. But ultimately, as crazy as that sounds, I don't really think that's that overpowered. Because remember, you are playing this, you're giving your opponent some time to dictate how that happens. Clearly, you're going to be freezing their board, so it might be hard for them to react immediately, but there's so much health on this guy that even when it passes back to you and you're in control of Arthas and you can attack with him, you're probably not going to be very easily able to suicide him to activate that death rattle, so it's going to be tough, and you're going to pass it back to your opponent again, and they're going to get to dictate what dies first and make trades in a way that's favorable so they can sacrifice their minions while killing Arthas, so that death rattle effect doesn't get as much value. Now that said, clearly, if you can somehow suicide your own Arthas, like if a priest ran this and they played it and then they Shadow Word Death their Arthas, that would be a little ridiculous. So I don't know that this card would work, because if they did have a full board of 7 dudes and you played Arthas and they couldn't kill it and then you Shadow Word Death your Arthas, you're going to kill their entire board of 7 minions, which is ridiculously OP, and then you're also going to do 21 damage to the enemy hero, which is ridiculously OP. So I think one way to make this more balanced, as crazy as this sounds, might actually be to give it can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, or some other effect that denies the controlling player from killing it quite as easily. So ultimately, I think the problem with this card design is that it just tries to do too much, and it has the potential to high roll like crazy. So I don't think this is the kind of card Blizzard would ever print, just because there's too many words, frankly, and too many effects. And it might actually be just a little bit better if you took off that final sentence that says, deal 3 damage to the enemy hero for every minion destroyed this way, or if you reduced this card's stats. Because right now I think it just does too much, too well, and it's pretty blatantly too good So not the best card design in my opinion. Moving on to the next card here, we have an 8-mana version of the Lich King, and this is the first of a couple that actually add in Frostmourne to the card. Of course, Frostmourne being Arthas' really popular, prominent lore weapon, as you can see in the artwork here and there and everywhere else. But this card starts off as a minion that's a 6/6, and it can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, so that's just a nice little kind of toss-in bonus for this card. Because really what you care about here, I think, is the Death Rattle, which says equip a 2/3 Frostmourne. And this is where this design starts to fall apart a little bit for me, because I think there's a bit of a mistake in how this is supposed to interact. Because this equips the 2/3 Frostmourne automatically upon the Lich King's death, but then also the Frostmourne card provided in this custom card says it has a battle cry. But of course, if it's automatically equipped, that battle cry won't actually take effect. The battle cry has to be activated when a card is played from hand. So I think that what the intent of this card is to say it's not actually a battle cry, but it just has a base effect that says gain +1/+0 for every minion that died while the Lich King was on board. So essentially, if you play that Lich King out there, and it's kind of annoying for your opponents to kill, right, because it can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, so they might have to trade a few smaller things into it. Say they trade 2 3/2s into it, then this Frostmourne is going to become a 4/3 weapon instead of just a 2/3 weapon, because 2 minions died while the Lich King was actually out there on the board, which is a really cool design, by the way. I like that a lot. I think just the execution of the wording here and the keywords and the mechanics fell a little bit, but if you just chopped off that battle cry, I think you could probably make this work, or just say something like, when equipped, when this weapon is equipped, gain +1/+0, etc. But I like this from both a mechanics in Hearthstone standpoint, but also in a sort of lore standpoint, because rune blades and so on and so forth are known for capturing the souls of their enemy victims, essentially. And this is capturing that mechanically because it's gaining strength as enemy minions die when presumably the Lich King kills them with Frostmourne, which is really, really cool. And I don't think this would be particularly overpowered. You're paying 8 mana for a minion here, and you're not really getting that weapon back for a while. So even though it's free, it's on a delayed effect. You can think about this very similarly to Tyrion. It's not more powerful than Tyrion necessarily. In fact, it might even be a little bit weaker than Tyrion. It has some more potential upside than Tyrion, because that could be a 6/3, a 7/3 weapon. But I would say on average, it's probably going to be like a 3/3 or 4/3. So maybe not quite as strong as Tyrion, because it doesn't have taunt and it doesn't have divine shield. Clearly it can't be targeted, but I think that's a worse keyword in general than Tyrion's many keywords. But the one difference here too, though, is that this is a neutral minion and not a class specific legendary, so everybody could run it, could give access to everybody to a card like Tyrion, a very strong Death Rattle card, which I think would be really good for the game. So I actually think this is one of the better Lich King card designs in this video. I like this one a lot, minus that minor wording issue. If you got the wording here right, this would be a pretty fantastic version of the Lich King in my mind. So let's move on to the next one here. This one might look a little weird. I think that's because this was designed originally with the idea of a new Death Knight class, where this was going to be a class-specific legendary for new Death Knights. So that's why it's got the weird sort of teal coloring in the background. But I think we can just ignore that and look at this card as is, as if it were a neutral legendary minion. This one's an 8 mana Lich King that's a 6/12 in stats, and it has a really cool, interesting effect I haven't really ever thought about before, but it says the health of both heroes can't be reduced below 1 as long as the Lich King is on board. So I think that's really, really intriguing to go through all the different ways that effect actually impacts the game. Essentially, this is an ice block attached to a minion, because when you play this, your opponent cannot kill you. If they want to end the game, they have to deal with Lich King, which means they might have to trade their entire board into it. They might have to use some sort of damage spell on Lich King instead. So there's this weird balancing act where they say, do I hit his face until he goes down to 1 health and then deal with Lich King next turn? Or do I have to deal with the Lich King now and do my damage later? I think it adds a lot of different skill levels and makes the game a little bit higher skill cap when this is on the board. But there's also the implication that if your Lich King does stay out there and live, you also can't win the game. So you have to find a way to kill your Lich King to win the game. And frankly, a 12 health Lich King like this would be fairly difficult to kill for a lot of classes. So your opponent might be able to build tons of card advantage, or a really wide board of value that you can't trade into until the point where they find that fireball, kill your Lich King, and then have a huge board of stuff to run over you with. So they can kind of balance it out too and find ways to use this card to their advantage as opposed to your advantage. But since you're playing it, it would give you the ability to dictate when that happens, and you could really think strategically about, is this going to help me? Is this going to put me in a bad spot? So I just think it's a really cool design. Like, that's a very interesting mechanic and something we haven't ever seen before that would make both players have to think a lot and make a ton of strategic decisions. It clearly would make silences a lot better and hexes and polymorphs and all those sorts of things. But that's probably going to be the case anyway with a really strong card like this one. But I don't know that it fits necessarily thematically with the Lich King, because he's really all about killing people, not keeping people alive necessarily. So I don't know if that side of it fits, but as far as mechanically stats and cost and balance are concerned, I think this card gets a lot of things right, and I like it quite a bit. So let's move on to the next card. This is another one with a sort of side card or token card, although this time it's not Frostmourne, it's Sindragosa, Arthas' Frostworm. But Arthas himself here, let's start off, he's a 9-mana minion, he's a 4/7 in stats, and he has a cool battle cry that says, raise the Frostworm Queen Sindragosa into the battlefield, which is a very stylistically interesting way to just say summon Sindragosa, right? And then Sindragosa, as you can see, is a 2/4 dragon, and it has a ridiculous effect. At the end of your turn, freeze all characters except Arthas and Sindragosa, and then your minions also cost 4 more mana, which is an incredible penalty, but it might be necessary because being able to freeze every character on the board is really powerful in certain matchups. Just imagine that. Your opponent basically, if they don't have exactly a spell to kill Sindragosa immediately, their board is just going to be locked out forever. So some decks that are hyper-reliant on minions instead of things, well, minions and weapons specifically, instead of spells, if they don't have a 4 damage spell removal option, they will never be able to interact with Sindragosa, which is probably a little bit broken in some regards, just because it does mean some decks just couldn't ever win. They couldn't do anything, and I don't think that's a particularly healthy thing for the meta, because it wouldn't be overpowered against certain control decks or mid-range decks, but against certain aggro decks like Pirate Warrior, for instance, they would not be able to kill this. With maybe a Kor'kron Elite, eventually, if they top-decked that, would be able to kill Sindragosa, but otherwise they'd just be stuck for a really long time, which means that the player of Arthas here gets to attack for 6 damage uncontested every single turn. Now, they also can't do much else because their minions are really costly, and everything on their board gets frozen too, so there's some downsides, but I still think it would be a bit of an unhealthy balance just because it would lock out so many different kinds of decks, and it would be an almost instant win against some matchups, which is not a very healthy or fun way to play Hearthstone. All that said, I still think it's pretty creative. It's not unbalanced in some matchups. It actually would work really well in some matchups, I think. It's a cool mechanic against control and perhaps even mid-range. But I still just don't think this card would work. Plus, I'm not sure that this feels like Arthas because it's only a 4/7 minion. Doesn't Arthas need to have a little bit bigger stats than that? Like, he needs to at least be able to contest more mid-range stuff. So, I'm not sure. Sindragosa in particular, too, doesn't feel like a 2/4. She's this giant Frostworm. So thematically, I kind of get it. But all in all, I just think there are some major problems with how this card would actually interact with the meta. And it's therefore not one of my favorites here. Moving on to the next choice here, we have another card with a really cool visualization. This time around, it's Arthas the Accursed, a 9-mana 7/5 minion, with a battle cry that says, destroy a random friendly minion and then summon 2 random friendly minions that died this game. So I like this a lot thematically because he's a Death Knight, he kills stuff and he brings it back to life. That's really cool, and plus he brings more back to life because he's summoning all these undead hordes and stuff. That's really cool, I like that a lot. Plus, of course, the visual style of this card is insanely awesome. They got all that completely correct. Now, as far as how strong this card is and how strong that battle cry is, I'm not totally sure. It clearly makes sense. If you can play this and you can kill a Silverhand Recruit and then summon a Tyrion and a Sunkeeper Tarim, let's say, because that's everybody's favorite Paladin cards, right? Then that's a really good trade. So there are going to be instances where that happens, because you can control when you play this, so you're going to be able to control what kinds of friendly minions are on the board, and often you might be able to put it in a scenario where it's just a little token minion or whatever. You play the Firefly and you play Arthas, and then boom, you get a really good trade up. But even in instances where you have to kill something good, I think this is still often going to be a trade up, especially in decks that synergize with killing their minion. Imagine this with like a Devilsaur's Egg, for instance, right? If you run a lot of those kinds of Death Rattle minions with tons of upsides, this is the kind of card that could really abuse that, because you kill a Devilsaur's Egg, you get the 5/5, and you also get 2 even medium or small sized minions back, then that's going to be a really strong play. So in the right kind of deck, this seems like the kind of card that could really be powerful in the late game. I think it's important that it's 9 mana instead of 8 because of the classes that could summon tokens, specifically with Paladin and Shaman. Otherwise, you might just be able to guarantee that you kill a really low cost minion. And at 9 mana, it means that's not a guarantee for those classes, which means you have to have something lingering around on the board or have a really low cost card in your deck and in your hand to actually make this work. So it's a little bit less consistent, a little bit less guaranteed, but still a ton of upside potential here, a lot of synergy, build around potential, all of which are cool things. The card itself, as a 7/5, not overpowered. It's got that Illidan stat line that's not great. It would clearly be better as a 5/7. It would feel meatier, that N'Zoth style instead of the Illidan style. So maybe a swap around there could make it considerably stronger, but ultimately I think this could still be the kind of card that saw play. I don't think it'd be deck defining though, and I don't think it'd be meta defining, which is what I'd like to see from an Arthas card. Arthas, I think, needs to be high impact and be the kind of card you see often just because he's such a prominent character. So I think this one would fall just a little bit short in that regard. Moving on to my next Lich King card. Here we have a 9 mana version that's a 7/10 and says at the end of every turn, destroy a random minion. And it also has a Death Rattle that equips Frostmourne, and then we look over here at Frostmourne. This is really interesting. Frostmourne, it's a 5/1, and it says whenever your opponent plays a minion, freeze it and deal damage to the attack of this weapon loses 1 attack. So a little bit of a Gore Howl interaction there, but probably a weapon you're not actually going to be attacking with much because it's much better as just a passive minion that's going to be freezing stuff that your opponent plays and dealing damage to them. So it's almost like a snipe, and a Gore Howl had a baby and it was Frostmourne. So it interacts a little bit like a snipe, essentially, with how it actually influences the board. But let's try to break this down, because I actually think this card's kind of halfway cool, maybe a little bit overpowered, probably in fact a lot overpowered, but still it does some things that work well. So a 7/10 minion for 9, stats feel fine. That's big, strong Lich King, which I like. The effect of Lich King himself, it says destroy a random minion. That's not a random enemy minion, so that can be your own minions as well. So this is the kind of card that has a major downside if you're playing from ahead. And that makes it pretty risky to play, particularly because it doesn't have taunt or anything. So it has that sort of Ultrasaur stat line where you just play it and it doesn't necessarily do anything. Although, the way this is worded, I think it could destroy itself, maybe. It's hard to say. I don't know how this would be coded right. It's not a real card, so we'll never really know. But theoretically, I think the Lich King could kill itself, which would normally be bad, but Frostmourne as a Death Rattle kind of does make it a little bit better if it kills itself. So it's a super risky card to play. If your opponent has like one big threat out there, then you play Lich King, you might get a 50-50 scenario where you're going to have a good chance of killing their thing and gaining a lot of upside because you swung the board. Or alternatively, you get a mediocre play because you didn't kill their big threat, but you get a Frostmourne back, and that's okay. But if it couldn't kill itself, if it says any other random minion, I think Lich King gets way, way better in that scenario, because you can use it as single target removal if your opponent just has that Tyrion out there. You're gonna guaranteed kill that Tyrion. Spoiler alert. And then they still have to deal with your Lich King, and even when they do deal with your Lich King, you're still getting back this really, really powerful Frostmourne. And then as far as Frostmourne itself is concerned, it's a really good card. It's something your opponent could play around a little bit, right? Because they could basically play a 2 health minion and then a 1 health minion and burn through essentially your charges of Frostmourne. But even then, it's still getting a lot of value. It's the kind of weapon that gets to attack essentially 5 times, and you don't take any face damage in the process. That's a lot of upside too. So it could cause a lot of friction and frustration for your opponent trying to play around it. So ultimately, depending on how this card actually works with its effect and the wording there, It feels like it could be really good. It might still just be a little bit too slow because your opponent doesn't necessarily have to kill the Lich King, and you don't have to get that Frostmourne back, because Frostmourne does help you as a swing card with a lot of slowdown potential against your opponent. By the way, I think this is intended to be a warrior card based on the banner here and the golden card artwork. Clearly would work in warrior. That's probably why we see the similarities to Gorehowl. But I think it could still just be a neutral legendary as well. I wouldn't see any problems with that. So I was kind of judging it in that regard. Doesn't make much difference as far as the overall qualities of the card are concerned. But so at the end of the day, I like some of the things this one does. I'm a little bit worried it could be just too overpowered and too good based on the wording of that effect. So it's a bit iffy for me. Moving on to the second to last Lich King, my version is up next. This one is a 9 mana 8/8. It has Taunt by default, and a neat little battle cry here. It says freeze adjacent minions and gain +2/+2 for each one frozen. So unfortunately, I think this is a cool idea for a card, but I just don't think it's very good. Essentially what happens here is you play Lich King. If you have a board of stuff, the most you're going to get out of this is +4/+4, so then it becomes a 9 mana 12/12 taunt, which is a very big body. It could be frustrating for a lot of decks to get through, right? But at the end of the day, by the time you get to turn 9, typically the fact that it has 12 attack is not that relevant. You just as soon have an Ancient of War most of the time, right, where you just get 5 attack because that's trading into multiple smaller things, and the 12 attack probably doesn't make that much of a difference. Plus, of course, there's a pretty big downside here in that you're freezing those adjacent minions, so essentially you're sacrificing quite a bit just to gain those extra stats, which doesn't feel very good. And there's nothing about this card that keeps it from just being removed, right? Like, removal is always a threat there as well. So a couple things I think could fix this and make it a really interesting card is if it gave the frozen adjacent minions taunt and also gave them +2/+2. So it was something like a Defender of Argus bundled in with the Lich King itself. That would be really neat because you're saying like, okay, I'm going to encase these dudes in ice, and therefore you're going to have to attack through them because I'm also encased in ice, and we're kind of building this wall of ice. But they get extra stats because, of course, they're harder to beat through because they're encased in ice. And so is the Lich King encased in ice. So you get like 3 really big taunts, and you get this giant taunt wall. That would be worthy of a 9 mana card and worthy of the lore of the Lich King, right? That sounds much, much better to me. Maybe even if this just said can't be targeted, it would be a lot better too. Some people might say that's just a strictly better Sogoth the Slitherer. Sure. I think it would be, but you're sacrificing a little bit because you are freezing your own minions, so that would probably still be okay and still be in line with what the Lich King is about. So I'd like that as well. So some cool stuff to build on here as far as an idea. I just don't think this version of the card is good enough and doesn't quite get there. So with those improvements, though, really neat idea that could be executed upon really well. And now finally, it's time for my version of Arthas, the Lich King. It's probably not the most creative. I'm going to admit that right away. Maybe not even the most balanced, but this is what I would want to see from the Lich King. So I'm not claiming to be a card designer. I'm not claiming this is what it will be or what it should be. But this is how I would build Arthas the Lich King. And as I mentioned previously in the video, it's going to look a lot like N'Zoth and even a little bit like one of those previous versions of the card that we saw. For me, Arthas the Lich King is a 10 mana minion. It's a 6/7 in stats, so just a little bit bigger than N'Zoth, right? And it has a battle cry that says, summon 6 enemy minions that died this game. So much like N'Zoth summons Death Rattle minions that died this game on your side of the board, Arthas is a little bit more universal than that to me, because ultimately what is Arthas about? He's about killing dudes and then bringing those dudes back to life on his side, forging a Death Knight army. And that is exactly what this card would do. Whenever you kill dudes, guess what? Arthas is going to bring those dudes back to life, but he's going to do it on your side of the battlefield as opposed to your opponent's. So he's not summoning your own minions that died like we see with N'Zoth or even with the Kazakis potion. Arthas is taking your enemy minions and bringing them into his service. So some people might say that this is just a little bit too overpowered because it's basically a N'Zoth that's unconditional. In other words, N'Zoth right now has to have a condition met. You have to play Death Rattle minions, so you have to build your deck in a certain way, and that requires some compromises and some certain decisions to be made. Plus, you have to have played those Death Rattle minions, and they have to die, so there's quite a bit of conditions there. So often when you play N'Zoth, you're just getting like 2, 3, or 4 minions back of, varying mana costs and qualities. But when you play Arthas, as long as he's in your deck, you don't have any conditions to meet. So you just play him, and something's going to happen. As long as your opponent has ever played minions, guess what? You're probably going to summon a few things, and often by the time you get to turn 10, usually you will have killed 6 minions of your opponent, so you're going to summon those minions back to life. Now, the thing about this is, though, is clearly this is not going to be very good against aggro decks, so it's immediately balanced pretty well as far as the meta is concerned, in my mind, because it sucks against aggro. If you're playing a Pirate Warrior, you have Arthas in your opening hand, you're basically screwed. Even if you play him on turn 10, you're just going to summon a bunch of junky pirates that aren't worth anything, and it's not that strong of a 10-mana play. Now, clearly in a control deck, Arthas gets a lot better with very little downside, but guess what? Everybody has access to it. The other control deck can run it too, and that's what I want Arthas to be. He's such an iconic, important part of Warcraft. I think he's the kind of card that should be included in a wide variety of decks. Clearly, he's not in the classic set, so he's not going to be around forever. So he could be one of those just Yogg-Saron, one-of inclusions that just gets played a ton. Clearly, there's some randomness here, which sucks. We all hate randomness. But on average, if you're summoning that many minions, the randomness is going to average itself out, right? And you're going to have a bit of control over it because you're going to know what has died. So it's going to be predictable. It's like, okay, I know I killed a Tyrion, so his Arthas is probably going to get a Tyrion back. But wait, what if I kill 3 more minions first, and then there's 8 minions in the pool, there's a chance he doesn't summon Tyrion, etc., etc. All kinds of different decisions and gameplay implications and strategies and holding your resources, all of that comes into play. There are still just widespread removal options like Brawl and Twisting Nether that could just single-handedly deal with this card. And unlike N'Zoth, which sometimes if you Brawl a N'Zoth board or you Twisting Nether that N'Zoth board, they still get a lot of value back. That's less likely to happen with Arthas because it's not going to be Death Rattle minions that are giving you something in return. It might just be all stat-based, and it might just be on-board value instead of in-hand value or pass-back value. So I actually think this would be a fairly balanced card that would still be very strong, clearly quite good in Control v Control matchups. Could be the kind of thing that you just toss into a mid-range deck as that final finishing piece that just gives you the swing potential and that last resort to win the game. So I think it'd be a really cool tool that you could combine really effectively with different kinds of removal and different kinds of classes and different plans and gameplay strategies. So that's why I like this particular version of Arthas the Lich King. But of course, all that said, as many versions of this card as I showed, we don't really have any idea what Blizzard's going to come up with for Arthas. In fact, we don't even know there's going to be a Lich King card, but I'm curious what you guys have to say. What do you think Arthas should look like? What kind of card befits the legend of Arthas the Lich King? Was it one on this list? Did you have a favorite of these 10? Were there any in this list you hated particularly so, and you just don't think these are the kinds of cards that should ever be seen in Hearthstone? Let me know. I'm really curious to hear your opinion. I want to hear your take on Arthas. All I know is I'm just dying to see what Arthas is going to look like in Knights of the Frozen Throne if he does show up as a card, and I'm certainly going to be building a deck with Arthas day one regardless because I can't wait to play with Arthas. So I am ultimately excited, and I hope you guys are too. So that day will soon be coming, and then we'll finally know exactly what Arthas looks like. But I hope this list will hold you over until then. So guys, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.